On March 20th, 2012, the crew of a Royal Canadian Air Force patrol aircraft was flying a routine surveillance run over the cold, gray water of the North Pacific, about 150 nautical miles off the coast of Haida Gwaii, the remote island chain off the western edge of British Columbia. There was nothing out there. There is almost never anything out there. This is some of the emptiest ocean on the planet, a vast stretch of open water between Asia and North America, where the swells run for thousands of miles without touching land. And then, far below the aircraft, the crew saw a ship. It was a fishing boat, about 164 feet long, rust-streaked and weathered, riding low and slow in the swell. It was moving, barely, at about 1 knot, drifting eastward toward the North American coast. The aircraft circled. There were no lights. There was no radio response. There was no flag, no signal, no movement on deck. The boat was simply there, alone, in the middle of the empty ocean, creeping toward the coast of Canada at the speed of the current that carried it. No one was aboard. No one had been aboard for over a year. The boat had a name, painted on her hull in faded Japanese characters. Ryou-Un Maru, fishing luck, and the story of how she came to be drifting unmanned off the coast of Canada, more than 4,000 miles from the harbor where she had been tied up, is one of the strangest ghost ship stories of the modern age, because we know exactly what set her loose, and it was one of the worst disasters of the 21st century. The Ryou-Un Maru was built around 1982. She was a squid and shrimp fishing vessel owned by a fishing company based in Hokkaido, the northernmost of Japan's main islands. For roughly 3 decades, she worked the cold, productive waters of the north, hauling in her catch season after season, an ordinary working boat among thousands of ordinary working boats. By 2010, she was old. Her owner decided she had reached the end of her useful life and was no longer worth running. He moored her at Hachinohe, a port in Aomori Prefecture on the northeastern coast of Honshu, and left her there, tied up, waiting to be sold for scrap. Her working life was over. She was an old boat at a dock, going nowhere, slated for the breakers. And then, on the 11th of March, 2011, at 2:46 in the afternoon, the seabed off the northeastern coast of Japan moved. It was a magnitude 9.0 earthquake, the most powerful ever recorded in Japan, and one of the most powerful in the history of the world. The seafloor along a fault line hundreds of miles long lurched upward, displacing an unimaginable volume of water and sending a tsunami racing toward the Japanese coast. The waves reached heights of over 40 meters in some places. They came ashore along hundreds of miles of coastline, sweeping inland for miles, destroying entire towns, killing nearly 20,000 people, triggering the meltdown of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. It was a catastrophe on a scale that is difficult to comprehend, a disaster that reshaped the coastline of an entire nation and killed people by the thousands in a matter of minutes. Among the countless things the tsunami swept away, in the grand accounting of a disaster that took 20,000 lives, was one old fishing boat tied up at a dock in Hachinohe, waiting to be scrapped. The waves tore the Ryou-Un Maru loose from her moorings and carried her out to sea. She was one of an estimated 5 million tons of debris that the tsunami dragged off the land and into the Pacific Ocean. Houses, cars, boats, furniture, entire sections of buildings, the wreckage of thousands of lives, all of it swept out into the open water in a single afternoon. About 70% of that debris sank close to shore. The rest began to drift. No one was looking for the Ryou-Un Maru. Why would they be? She was an old boat slated for scrap, with no crew aboard and no cargo, swept away in a disaster that had killed 20,000 people and destroyed whole cities. In the overwhelming scale of the catastrophe, a single empty fishing boat was nothing. Everyone simply assumed she had sunk, like most of the debris. The Japan Coast Guard, processing the aftermath of the worst disaster in the nation's modern history, granted her owner an exception to the usual rules and allowed her registration to be cancelled. Under Japanese law, a ship normally has to be properly disposed of or dismantled before its registration can be cancelled. But everyone assumed the Ryou-Un Maru was gone, sunk somewhere off the coast in the chaos of the tsunami. Her registration was cancelled. On paper, she ceased to exist. She no longer had a legal owner responsible for her. But she had not sunk. She was floating, empty, somewhere out in the North Pacific, and she had begun one of the longest and loneliest voyages any vessel has ever made. For over a year, the Ryou-Un Maru drifted. She had no engine running, no one at the helm, no power, no lights, no purpose. She was at the complete mercy of the wind and the currents of the North Pacific. And the dominant current in those waters, the great clockwise gyre that circulates across the entire northern Pacific basin, took hold of her and carried her east. Slowly, relentlessly, over thousands of miles of open ocean, the empty boat drifted away from Japan and toward North America. She crossed the entire width of the Pacific Ocean, alone, unmanned, a dead boat carried by a living sea, moving at the pace of the water itself. The currents that carried her are the same ones that oceanographers have studied for decades by tracking floating objects, from shipping containers of bath toys lost overboard to the debris of disasters. The North Pacific Gyre is a slow, vast rotation of water, and objects caught in it can travel astonishing distances over months and years, circling the ocean basin or being flung across it, depending on where they enter. The Ryou-Un Maru entered it off the coast of Japan and was carried along the northern arm of the gyre, the path that leads toward Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. She was, in effect, a giant drift marker, an accidental experiment in ocean current science, except that she was a 164-foot steel ship instead of a buoy. Think about what that crossing involved. The North Pacific is one of the most violent bodies of water on Earth, especially in winter. Storms sweep across it with enormous force. Waves build to staggering heights. For over a year, the Ryou-Un Maru rode through all of it, with no one aboard to steer her, to bail her, to keep her head into the waves, to do any of the 1,000 things a crew does to keep a vessel alive in heavy weather. She simply endured it, an empty hull rolling and pitching through storm after storm, somehow staying afloat, somehow not capsizing, somehow surviving conditions that would have tested a fully crewed and powered ship. She had no one to save her, and no one to lose. She just drifted, and the ocean, for reasons of its own, let her live. There is something genuinely eerie about an empty ship surviving what crewed ships do not. A vessel at sea is normally a constant act of maintenance, a running battle between the crew and the water that wants to come in. Pumps run, hatches are secured, the helm is held. The moment a ship is abandoned, that battle is supposed to end quickly, and the sea is supposed to win. The Ryou-Un Maru did not get that memo. For more than a year, she fought the battle with no soldiers, and she kept winning, night after night, storm after storm, across 4,000 miles. She became, in the most literal sense, a ghost ship. Not a legend, not a story embellished over centuries, but a real, physical ghost ship adrift in the modern ocean, tracked eventually by satellites and aircraft, an object with no owner, no crew, and no legal existence, crossing an ocean under the power of nothing but the current. In March of 2012, a year after the tsunami, the Ryou-Un Maru entered Canadian waters. On the 23rd of March, the Canadian Coast Guard located her drifting about 120 miles off Haida Gwaii. A few days earlier, the Royal Canadian Air Force Patrol had spotted her from the air. The ghost ship had crossed the Pacific. After more than 4,000 miles and over a year alone at sea, the Ryou-Un Maru had arrived off the coast of North America, still afloat, still drifting, still empty. Her arrival created an unusual problem. She was a derelict vessel with no owner, no crew, and no registration, drifting slowly toward a coastline and a busy shipping area. She was a hazard to navigation. A 164-foot steel hull adrift in shipping lanes is a serious danger to other vessels, especially at night or in poor visibility. She could collide with a ship. She could run aground and break up on the coast, spilling whatever fuel remained in her tanks. Something had to be done about her. But she belonged to no one, and she was carrying an unknown quantity of diesel fuel. And she was sitting in international and then American waters, with no clear party responsible for her. The United States Coast Guard took over as the Ryou-Un Maru drifted into the Gulf of Alaska. On the 1st of April, 2012, she crossed into United States waters. The Coast Guard tracked her carefully. On the 4th of April, a Coast Guard aircraft dropped a tracking buoy aboard the drifting hulk, which was then about 170 nautical miles southwest of Sitka, Alaska. The next day, the crew of the Coast Guard cutter Anacapa, a 110-foot patrol cutter based in Alaska, moved in to assess her condition and decide what to do. The decision was made to sink her. Towing her to port was the obvious alternative, but she was old, derelict, full of fuel, and structurally questionable after a year of being battered across the Pacific. The cleanest solution, the Coast Guard determined, was to send her to the bottom in deep water, far from shore, where she could do no harm. And then, just before the Anacapa opened fire, the story took one more strange turn. A Canadian fishing vessel arrived on the scene. The Bernice Sea, a 62-foot fishing boat, claimed salvage rights over the Ryou-Un Maru in international waters. Under maritime law, an abandoned vessel with no owner can be claimed by whoever can take possession of it. And the crew of the Bernice Sea saw an opportunity. A free 164-foot steel fishing boat, even a derelict one, was worth something. The Coast Guard halted its plans and gave the Canadian crew their chance. The Bernice Sea attempted to take the ghost ship. They tried to get a line aboard and tow her, but the Ryou-Un Maru had a ruptured fuel tank, and pumping it out proved impossible, and towing the waterlogged, damaged hulk through the open ocean was beyond what the small fishing boat could manage. The master of the Bernice Sea, once he was actually alongside the derelict and could see her condition up close, determined that she was not safe to salvage or tow. The Canadians gave up. They left the area. The ghost ship was alone again, for the last time. With the salvage attempt failed and the boat declared a hazard to navigation, the Coast Guard cutter Anacapa carried out its orders. On the 5th of April, 2012, about 180 miles west of the southeast Alaskan coast, the Anacapa opened fire on the Ryou-Un Maru with its 25mm autocannon, using explosive ammunition. The crew treated it, in part, as a live fire gunnery exercise. The ghost ship did not die easily. The Anacapa fired round after round, as many as 100 or more. The explosive shells punched holes in the old hull and set her ablaze. Flames erupted across the deck and the superstructure. Smoke poured into the sky over the empty ocean, and still she floated. The Ryou-Un Maru, which had survived a tsunami, which had crossed the entire Pacific Ocean alone through a year of storms, which had endured everything the sea could throw at her without a single human hand to help her, did not want to go down. She burned, and she took on water, and still she stayed on the surface for hours. There is a strange dignity in that resistance, even if it is only the physics of a well-built hull. The Coast Guard gunners were experienced, the ammunition was explosive, and the target was an old, stationary, undefended boat. By every expectation, she should have gone down quickly. Instead, she absorbed punishment that would have sunk many vessels and stayed afloat, burning for hour after hour, as if the year-long habit of survival had become something she could not break. The crew of the Anacapa watched a derelict fishing boat refuse to sink under conditions designed specifically to sink her. It was, in its way, the same stubborn buoyancy that had carried her across an entire ocean. The thing that had kept her alive for a year was now the thing that would not let her die. The cutter eventually came alongside the burning hulk and used fire hoses to put out the flames and to fill the now-holed ship with water, hastening the end. Finally, at about 6:15 in the evening, after 4 hours, the Ryou-Un Maru gave up. She listed over, and she sank, going down into 6,000 feet of water in the Gulf of Alaska. The long, lonely voyage of the Japanese ghost ship was over. It is worth sitting with the strangeness of that ending. A boat that was set loose by one of the deadliest natural disasters of the century, that crossed an entire ocean by herself over the course of more than a year, that survived storms that would have sunk many crewed vessels, was finally destroyed not by the sea, but by cannon fire, sunk deliberately by a military vessel because she had become too dangerous to leave afloat. She survived everything the ocean did to her. She did not survive arriving. The Ryou-Un Maru was the most famous of the tsunami ghost ships, but she was not the only piece of that disaster to cross the ocean. The 5 million tons of debris swept out to sea in March of 2011 did not all sink. For years afterward, pieces of it washed up on the beaches of North America. Docks, boats, motorcycles in shipping containers, a soccer ball that was traced back to its owner, a Japanese teenager, by the name written on it, personal belongings of people who had died in the waves, carried across the Pacific, and deposited on foreign shores, years after the disaster that killed their owners. The ocean had swallowed 20,000 lives, and an entire coastline's worth of debris, and then, slowly, over years, it began handing pieces of it back on the other side of the world. Some of those returns were almost unbearably personal. A volleyball washed ashore in Alaska with a name on it, and was returned to a young woman in Japan who had lost her home and family in the tsunami. A large floating dock, 66 feet long and weighing 165 tons, drifted all the way to a beach in Oregon and grounded there, more than a year after the wave that tore it loose. Fishing boats, refrigerators, fragments of houses, all of it riding the same currents that carried the Ryou-Un Maru, all of it arriving on the beaches of Alaska, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and California in the months and years that followed. Each piece was a small, silent message from a catastrophe, delivered late and at random along thousands of miles of foreign coastline. Scientists set up programs to track it, to catalog it, to try to predict where and when the next wave of debris would come ashore. The disaster, in a sense, kept arriving for years after it happened. And the officials who tracked the debris warned that the Ryou-Un Maru might not be the last ghost ship. With millions of tons of debris still drifting, with an unknown number of boats torn loose in the disaster, there could be others out there still. Empty hulls riding the currents of the North Pacific, crossing the ocean at the speed of the water, waiting to be spotted by some aircraft on a routine patrol over the empty gray water, or waiting to never be spotted at all, to simply drift until they fill with water and slip beneath the surface in some unwitnessed corner of the sea. The Ryou-Un Maru was a ghost ship in the truest modern sense. There was no mystery about her crew, because she had no crew. There was no puzzle about what happened to her people, because her people were never aboard. She was something stranger, and in some ways sadder than a traditional ghost ship. She was a piece of a catastrophe, a single object torn loose from a disaster that killed 20,000 human beings, set adrift to make a year-long journey across the largest ocean on Earth, entirely alone, carrying nothing but the fact of what had happened to the country she came from. She was an old boat that should have been scrapped quietly at a dock. Instead, the sea took her on the longest voyage of her life, after her life was already over, and carried her 4,000 miles to a place she was never meant to go. And then she was shot and burned and sunk, and the ocean closed over her in 6,000 feet of cold water, and the long, lonely voyage of the ghost ship was finally, completely over. If you want to hear the stories of what else the sea has taken and never returned, subscribe. There's always another ship that never came home.